Hello and welcome to the Blood Spiller channel. This is a brand new channel and I thought I'd kick it off with one of my favorite subjects ever, Hammer horror. This is my all-time top 10 Hammer horror films. And before we get into the top 10, I just want to give a shout out to a film that I felt I couldn't leave off the list, but I did. Dracula, Prince of Darkness from 1966. It's the first Dracula with Christopher Lee back. It's the first direct sequel, if you ignore Brides of Dracula, that didn't have Christopher Lee at all. But Christopher Lee appears like halfway through this film, and he doesn't have any lines. It doesn't make his performance any less impactful. Got that kind of look to him where he just inspires like a confident fear to him. You also got Barbara Shelley, Andrew Keir as a priest that is maybe not your run-of-the-mill normal priest. Francis Matthews, who's great. He's been in other Hammer films, just like Andrew Keir and just like Barbara Shelley. But this is a really decent sequel to Horror of Dracula. It even has the same theme song. It does suffer from that let's go here, let's go back there, you stay put while I go there. A lot of films, maybe on the Hammer umbrella, kind of suffered from that. But I wanted to mention this because it's a great film. And I appreciate this is not going to be on many people's top 10, but Dracula 80, 1972. This is the first Hammer film where it brought Dracula into the modern age, which around this time was around 1972. I did not think I would like this when I first watched it. I actually got this actual DVD in my Easter basket one year when I was just like a mid-teenager. And I was like, oh yeah, I haven't seen that one. I'll give it a try sometime. I probably watched it later that day, but ever since, I've just had a blast with Dracula 80, 1972. It brings back the dream team of having Cushing and Lee together. Cushing playing a descendant of Van Helsing now, and Stephanie Beacham playing his granddaughter. And the movie's kind of focused on her and her friends as they're looking for kicks. They're supposed to be kids, but they seem older. Like they own flats and go out for drinks and stuff like that, but they're basically looking for a good time. I guess London is very, very not happening in the 70s, and they always must be looking for something. But Cushing eventually finds out that Dracula is the one killing her friends, so he has to get involved. Great film. It's a hell of a time. There's some gothic atmosphere for 1970s London, believe it or not. Number 9 for the list is Scars of Dracula. The one that everybody thinks is a little too cheap. This is the follow-up to Taste the Blood of Dracula. People have debated whether this Dracula entry is maybe like almost a prequel to like Horror of Dracula or whatnot. It's almost like they attempted to reboot it and just do a Dracula story where he's at his castle and he has to, kill people, drink their blood. He has, the villagers attempt to burn the castle down, which seems hard to do. Clove, who is not the same Clove as Prince of Darkness. He is the manservant of Dracula, and he makes sure that the castle, much like Clove from Prince of Darkness, the castle is always ready to take visitors. Eventually, Dracula takes him out, basically. I like the leads in this a lot. Michael Gwynn plays the priest. He was actually the Frankenstein monster in Revenge of Frankenstein. Michael Ripper gets a much bigger part than he usually gets in one of these films. It's kind of like the evil of Frankenstein for the Dracula series. It's not always the warmest received by the fan base, but I've always loved it. I've loved the way it looks. It always had kind of a 70s soap opera feel to it for me. Lee gets the most lines in this, and there's quite a bit of blood. It's a good time. Interesting death. Random. So the next films on the list actually come in a double feature Blu-ray disc. So I will hold up one of these. The first one, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. This, for pound, is, in my opinion, the best screenplay Hammer has put out. It involves a love triangle between Paul Massey, Christopher Lee. They don't love each other. They're in love with Dawn Adams, who plays Kitty, which is Jekyll's wife. And Christopher Lee plays Paul Allen. But he has a little side thing going with Kitty. Jekyll throws himself into his work. He wants his wife to understand his work, and he also wants to be closer to his wife. When he commits to the experiment and he becomes Hyde, he is able to see that she's having this affair, but instead of simply calling her out for it, he has this kind of type of game he's playing with them, where he is under the impression that it's just a fling. But the further he goes into it, he realizes that maybe Kitty loves Paul Allen more than she loves Jekyll. Jekyll, in that sense, becomes a very different Hyde, where he's trying to essentially reclaim his wife. It's very interesting, the dynamics of the love triangle and how far Jekyll is willing to push himself into Hyde to see if he can win his wife back, basically. And if he can't, he might resort to very Hyde-like behavior. Other film on this is The Gorgon, 1964. The Gorgon was one of those first Hammer films that I burnt on DVD-R. I looked for it everywhere, and I was only able to find it, you could only find it on VHS back in the day. I burned it onto DVD-R and watched it, made my own title screens and everything like that. I've of course since bought it on DVD and Blu-ray, as you can see. But attempt at Hammer making their own monster in a way similar to the reptile. The Gorgon is, obviously a Greek mythology that they were going for, and they were just trying to create their own where they didn't really have to rely on what Universal had done. It's decent. I really liked it when it first came out. It has really nice Technicolor and a really original score. Again, you have Terrence Fisher, and you have Christopher Lee, and you have Peter Cushing. Barbara Shelley and Richard Pascoe played the two love leads. Richard Pascoe is there because his brother was killed and his father was killed trying to investigate his brother was killed. He goes to the town of Vandorf, and he learns of the spirit of a Gorgon that inhabits women, and he starts to think that his love interest, Barbara Shelley, is possessed. And Christopher Lee is the professor who tries to figure out what's going on. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee's typical roles are generally swapped, where Peter Cushing is kind of the bad guy, and he plays it with such a Christopher Lee-like stillness to him. Christopher Lee, on the other hand, is a little bit more intense. He almost kind of reminds me of doing the good guy version of his performance in Rasputin the Mad Monk, because he's such a bastard in that film. But in this, he's a good guy. He's just very no nonsense. At the sixth spot, we have Hound of the Baskervilles, the Hammer film that I may have seen the most. I remember my senior year of high school, I didn't have a lot of classes, so I would come home for lunch, and then a lot of the free periods that I had. This was always showing on HBO or Max during the day, my entire senior year, so I always put it on. So I've seen this probably between 100 and 200 times. I couldn't tell you the exact number, but I've seen it a lot. And I haven't seen a lot of Sherlock Holmes films. From what I have, nothing kind of comes this close to being hammery gothic atmosphere. You got Peter Cushing, who seems like he was born to play this role as Sherlock Holmes, and then you get Christopher Lee, who plays Sir Henry, he has to move to England and become the man of Baskerville Hall. He's got this inheritance from his uncle. Peter Cushing and Andre Morel, who plays Watson, are trying to figure out if somebody is trying to kill Sir Henry, kind of an assumption that the estate is a big motivating factor. I've heard people say it's a little bit anticlimactic. It is a beautiful film. It's got a lot of mood, a lot of fog, a lot of great Technicolor, a lot of great lighting. Cushing and Lee are fantastic in it, and it's just, it's one of those Hammer films that it's got to be in your first 5 or 6 watching. Number 5, and I debated putting this a little bit higher. It's really grown on me in recent years, but Brides of Dracula 1960, so this is 3 years after their venture into horror for Hammer. They come up with Brides of Dracula, which is supposed to be the sequel to Horror of Dracula, but Christopher Lee is not on board. He does not want to do it, so they get David Peel to play Baron Meinster, who, through some stories told in this, you kind of can deduce that Dracula turned him at one point. It sounds like at a house party or something like that, because Peter Cushing comes back. It feels like the Van Helsing Chronicles, where it's just another Van Helsing vampire story. And if that was the case, I wish they made a whole series of these. But I really like David Peel. He's very good. He's 40 here, but he looks like he's 26 or something. He's got kind of a suave nature to him, and he can be very scary sometimes with the right makeup and the right demeanor. Essentially, he gets away from the imprisonment by his mother, who has him shackled up in a wing of the castle, and he is fed by his mother these young girls who come through. Marianne Danielle is going to be another one of these victims. She's played by Yvonne Monlaur, who I actually met once back in 2011. She was lovely. She helps him to escape, and he kills his mother in retaliation, and they get married because that's how it goes. Or they're engaged to get married, basically, because that's how it goes. And Peter Cushing is Van Helsing trying to do his best not to upset Marianne Danielle, and also try to figure out, is this guy really a vampire? It's very good. It's very atmospheric. Some people even call it the best Dracula. It deserves to be high on everybody's list. Number 4, The Mummy. It's got the dream team of Terence Fisher as directing, Jimmy Stankster writing, and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in the lead roles. This was right after a couple films that they had done together, and this was the third one. There's like an original trilogy of Hammer films. Basically, Peter Cushing's father suffers some kind of mental breakdown in Egypt when they're excavating a tomb. Years later, he's in a psych ward, and Cushing finds out that an Egyptian has found the scroll of life, and he has brought back this mummy that was brought as an ancient Egyptian artifact to his house. He uses the scroll of life to bring it back and to get revenge on the desecrators of Princess Ananka's tomb. There's a lot of flashbacks in this, maybe a little bit dry in some areas and everything, but it's got great Technicolor atmosphere. It has a great swamp set, especially for the finale. Peter Cushing is doing a lot of acrobatic stuff, which he did in his early Hammer days, and Christopher Lee looks very imposing as the mummy, usually just conveying his emotions through basically his eyes, because he's covered everywhere else. He's very Karloff in this, as far as, like, he's not just a monster, you can tell there's some emotion behind those eyes. The Curse of Frankenstein for number 3. Curse of Frankenstein, I remember either AMC or TCM on the preview channel saying Curse of Frankenstein. I never heard of what that was. I knew what Frankenstein, James Whale version was. Very Technicolor-y. Peter Cushing's that plays the Mad Doctor, Victor Frankenstein. He has an assistant who was actually his tutor, Paul Kremp, who's played by Robert Urquhart. And you have Hazel Court, who plays Cushing's cousin, but they're going to be married because that's what you did. So they bring back a dog to life, and so instead of bringing people back to life or planning to, Victor's like, we need to build someone from scratch. And Paul's like, really? You know, we gotta go there all of a sudden? And he's very apprehensible, and eventually he's like, I can't do this anymore. But Victor Frankenstein succeeds, and brings back, stitches together a corpse that is eventually played by Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee goes to choke him out at one point, and Paul has to interfere, and they go to kill the creature. The creature never stays dead. So it's fantastic. It's got a great script. It's a slow burn, and it doesn't have a lot of actors in it, but it's a fantastic film. It's one of Hammer's top 3 in my opinion. If you can sit through this, like, I know there's not a ton of action in this, but Peter Cushing and Robert Urquhart and Hazel Court, they carry the film, and you know, you just need their performances.
Some things are best left alone, such as interfering in things which are beyond our powers.
Now, please don't misunderstand me. This is more than a superstition, I know. The danger is very real. The study of these creatures has been my life's work. I've carried out research with some of the greatest authorities in Europe, and yet we've only just scratched the surface. Victims consciously detest being dominated by vampirism, but are unable to relinquish the practice. Ultimately, death results from loss of blood. But unlike normal death, no peace manifests itself, for they enter into the fearful state of the undead. Since the death of Jonathan Harker, Count Dracula has disappeared. He must be found and destroyed.
Horror of Dracula for the number 2 spot. Horror of Dracula seems to be the film that everybody knows from Hammer. I watched it when I was a very young kid, probably, you know, around 10, 11, 12 or something on the Sci-Fi Channel early Saturday morning. Seeing Christopher Lee at the top of the staircase, fantastic. That was just the moment I knew I loved it. This has such a great rustic isolated, deserted castle feel to it at first that it just feels like you really are in some remote country at a castle in the middle of nowhere. At first, Harker goes there, played by John Van Essen. He goes there and it's a little bit different. He's not going there as a real estate agent. He's going to become the librarian there. But he is also under the instruction of Van Helsing, basically to take him out, and if he has any other vampires around. The problem is Harker takes out the bride of Dracula before Dracula, so it doesn't work out. Dracula eventually comes to England, and Peter Cushing basically spends his time trying to track down the Count. He frequently engages with Michael Gough and Melissa Stribling and Carol Marsh. But Dracula starts picking apart family, as he does in the book, actually. You know, there are some times in this where it's a little bit slow, but I still love the atmosphere, and Cushing carries this film. He's not quite like Sherlock Holmes, and he's not quite like Victor Frankenstein in this, but he owns the role with kind of a quiet dignity that feels like it has some urgency to it. One of Hammer's best. If you ask anybody, they probably would tell you this is their top spot. But for me, the #1 spot, and I guess it's just going to be me on this one, nobody else is going to say it, but Kiss of the Vampire from 1962, 63, 64, depends what country you got it in first. Kiss of the Vampire was at a time where Christopher Lee hadn't signed back on for another Hammer Dracula film, and they wanted to do vampire films. So this is a result of one of those films. You got Edward D. Souza, just got married to Jennifer Daniels' character, and they are the Harcourts, and they are traveling through Bavaria. Dr. Ravna is watching from a telescope from his chateau. They basically break down in a car because they have no gas left, and so they have to get towed to the local inn, which is very mysterious and spooky, and nobody stays there. They eventually get a letter from Ravna saying, I just noticed you broke down, and why don't you come on by? Come to the castle and we'll have a good night. And so they get dressed up and they go to the chateau. They are entertained by a family of vampires trying to be slowly hypnotized by them. It doesn't quite work, or the evening's cut short abruptly. They are eventually invited back for a much larger gathering with like a live band and everything like that. But something is going on under the surface, and these vampires they're very cultish in the way they work. They're very organized. Ravna is the lead member of this cult, and I find it interesting because they do lean heavily into the cult part, but there is enough evidence to suggest that this is a vampiric cult. It's just very interesting. It has a lot of great gothic shots, a lot of great cemetery work. Red Blood, Isabel Black. I used to have a huge crush on her when I was a kid. The performances are great. I especially love Edward D. Souza. He's the lead in this. He's also the lead for Hammer's other film, Phantom of the Opera. I actually wrote to Edward recently. He's, I believe, 91 years old. I wrote him a letter recently, and he replied, and he was very nice, and he said thank you for the letter, and he sent me a postcard back. Very nice guy. Just thought I'd reach out to him, tell him I still love your movie. This is a fantastic movie. I remember seeing it late night on TV. I remember seeing the alternative version, Kiss of Evil, when it came out on TV as well. This Blu-ray is fantastic. I've watched it a bunch. It has a lot of extra features. It's my favorite Hammer film. It's beautiful to look at. It's got gorgeous Eastman color. I mean, for Hammer, I don't think you could go wrong with this one. It seems to be the one I come back to more than anything else, and I love more than anything else. I really wish they made more films in this particular story. I feel like there's a lot of stuff to flesh out that they never did. Maybe somebody will make a sequel someday. Alright, that is my top 10 all-time Hammer horror films. If you have your own top 10 Hammer list, let me know in the comments below, and I'd love to see what you guys are all watching. Thanks for watching. Welcome to the channel. I appreciate it. I'll catch you guys next time.